A bit of a rough day. We'll hear some light in the shade. It's time now for a cute wee animal story. A tiny kitten was almost yesterday's news after it got caught up in newspapers being loaded onto a recycling belt at a Wellington waste station. Breathe easy though, the kitten was plucked to safety just in time. The SPCA's Alsford explains exactly what happened.
The team were loading newspapers onto the recycling belt and heard a tiny little squeal, and so they stopped all the operations to search for the source of the noise and found little Tiger on the recycling belt in between all the newspapers. Poor little fella.
So, that seems to be a lucky save. What happens on the recycling belt with the newspapers? Where do they end up?
Well, I would imagine they end up, being turned into packaging and put into big belts to put all the newspapers together. So I would imagine it probably wouldn't have been a very pleasant ending for poor Taika if they hadn't heard him making a little noise.
So what do you suspect has happened here? Was he tucked up in the newspapers?
He was tucked up in the newspapers, so we're not really 100% sure how he managed to get in between them. We like to think that he got separated from his mum and he found his way into the recycling station. But also there is a possibility that some very cruel person dumped him at the recycling station, and that's how he ended up in the newspapers.
How old do you reckon he is, and what kind of nick is he in?
Oh, surprisingly, he's in very, very good nick. Our veterinary team have estimated he's only 2 weeks old, poor little fella. So he's certainly way too young to be separated from his mum. He's been very vulnerable to diseases, and being on his own, he was risking of starvation and also injury, as you can imagine.
So how's he being looked after now?
So little Tiger is now with one of our foster families. He is being bottle fed 2 hourly, as is expected of a little kitten his age. And once he's big enough, he will be desexed and popped up for adoption to find a new loving family.
So I bet the people working at the recycle plant were kind of pleasantly surprised, because he's as cute as a button, isn't he?
Oh, he is as cute as a button, and they were very, very surprised. And fortunately, they were onto it as quickly as they could, and they brought him into us, and we took him immediately into our care. So they were very, very good in being very jacked up and bringing him into us.
Who will take him in the long run? Are you looking for someone to take him, or has that already been sorted?
Well, he'll stay with his foster family until he's big enough to be desexed. So he will be desexed once he weighs just on a kg, and then he will go into our normal adoption process. So once he's in the adoption process, we will be seeking a new family for him.
Hey, how much do you reckon he weighs at the moment, Ross?
Oh, he's a wee little fella, so he's only just 500 grams at the minute, so he's a tiny little fella. So he needs a little bit of fattening up before he's big enough to go through the system. So probably another 4 to 5 weeks yet before he's big enough to be desexed. And
Ross, did you get a little cat cuddle? Have you kind of met him firsthand?
I have. That's one of my privileges, is to meet all these little guys that come in, and he is a sweet little fella, bright as a button. He is certainly one very, very lucky little fella, and this is, again, another shocking story of survival that we've seen, and we are just exceptionally grateful for the team at the recycling station that helped him now on his road to recovery.